Hey everybody, it is Tuesday, June 18th. You're listening to the Mo.news podcast. I'm mo.news.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. A little bit of housekeeping as we begin today's podcast. A heads up, tomorrow is Juneteenth Day, a federal holiday now for a couple years running, which means we will not have a regular episode of the pod tomorrow.
If you can, in 2 minutes or less, can you tell us what exactly is Juneteenth for people who aren't familiar?
All right, Juneteenth is short for June 19th. It marks the day in 1865 when federal Union troops arrived in Galveston, Texas to announce that all enslaved people were to be freed. Now, notably, when I mentioned 1865, that is more than 2 years after Abraham Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which called for all enslaved people in Confederate states in rebellion against the Union to be free. And yet, 2 years after that, 2.5 years after that, frankly, there were still Black Americans in bondage. It didn't apply to Texas because Texas was not under Confederate control at the time. Remember, Texas was also an independent country decades earlier, so it prided itself on its independence. And so that was the case in Texas. You had some enslavers from Confederate states like Tennessee and Arkansas who had moved there with their slaves, seen as a safe haven for slavery. Anyhow, the Union troops had finally arrived in 1865, freed the slaves. Now, significantly, this had been celebrated, marked locally for more than a century. Then fast forward to 2016. At the time, an 89-year-old Texas woman named Opal Lee made it her mission to make Juneteenth a federal holiday. She walked from her home in Fort Worth to the nation's capital, walking 2.5 miles each day to commemorate the 2.5 years it took Black people in Texas to get their freedom. So she made that point in 2016, and that then was followed by the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020, leading President Biden to sign the proclamation of Juneteenth into law in 2021, our newest federal holiday.
Moshe, a fascinating history.
Jill, I'll say that, what's interesting is I remember a Fresh Prince of Bel-Air episode from the 90s where they talked about Juneteenth Day. And I always remember hearing about Juneteenth Day, and I always think about that Fresh Prince episode, reinforcing that pop culture can really teach you things. I remember watching that as a teenager, and that's where I first learned about it.
I'm going to go Google that episode. That's so interesting. All right. Very fascinating history. And again, there will be no podcast or newsletter tomorrow on Wednesday, but we will be back on Thursday. And with that, let's get to some headlines here. Similar to warnings on tobacco, the Surgeon General is calling for health warnings on social media for young users. President Biden taking on immigration again, but this time he wants to give a pathway to citizenship for hundreds of thousands of migrants already in the country. In the words of Nelly, it's getting hot in here. A heat wave sends temperatures soaring. So what exactly is a heat dome and how long will it be around? Some of the nation's top terror experts are warning of a potentially imminent attack, saying that the signs are similar to those before 9/11. Chicago issues a formal apology to Black citizens and creates a task force on reparations. And Maryland's governor pardons 175,000 marijuana convictions. All right, no more excuses about tech issues for anyone. NASA gets its Voyager 1 back online from 15 billion miles away after some technical problems. And Chuck Schumer getting roasted for his Father's Day barbecue picture.
Yeah, I don't know if we want Chuck manning the grill anytime soon at a barbecue near you.
Plus Moshe's on this day in history.
Your clue today, thunder only happens when it's raining. And players only love you when they're playing.
All right, Moshe, I know this one, but I'm not going to give it away in case there's anyone out there who does not know it.
We have that, and it's a big day for firsts for women, Jill. That's the theme of today's On This Day in History.
Okay, the U.S. Surgeon General issued a dire call for action on social media apps and their harmful influence over kids and teens. In a New York Times opinion column yesterday, Dr. Vivek Murthy writing that warning labels similar to those used on cigarettes should be added to social media, and he is demanding that Congress take action before it is too late for younger Americans. He writes, quote, "One of the worst things for a parent is to know that your children are in danger, yet be unable to do anything about it. There is no seatbelt for parents to click, no helmet to snap in place, no assurance that trusted experts have investigated and ensured that these platforms are safe for our kids. There are just parents and their children trying to figure it out on their own, pitted against some of the best product engineers and most well-resourced companies in the world." The Surgeon General compared social media today to tobacco decades ago, saying it is a product with a business model built on addiction. Warning labels on tobacco, by the way, were first implemented in 1965. That was after Congress was warned by the then Surgeon General about evidence about the impact of cigarettes. And there has since been a steady decline in smoking. Alcohol and cigarettes are currently the only two products that contain Surgeon General warnings. But Dr. Murthy says that the health risks that come with social media are just as profound. He cited research that found adolescents who spent more than 3 hours a day on social media face double the risk of anxiety and depression. That age group now spends more than 5 hours a day on social media. A 2022 Pew Research survey found 95% of kids ages 13 to 17 were on social media, and more than a third of them said that they used social media almost constantly.
Yeah, pretty incredible there, 95%. It's hard to find 95% of Americans of any age group that all do something. That compares, Jill, to the conversation I was having with Jonathan Haidt, which I'll get to in a second, the author of Anxious Generation. He was noting in his book in the mid-90s, a third of teens were smoking at its peak in the 90s, if you go into recent history. So that was a third of teens. Saying, hey, you're not cool if you don't smoke. Today, it's 95% of people on social media. So you had a choice whether or not to smoke and could go about living your life in the 90s. Today, not much of a choice. So notable here, the Surgeon General is speaking out. At the same time, he cannot act on his own. He needs Congress to get involved here and pass a bill in order to add warning labels to the apps. We should note there is still significant debate within the scientific community about the extent to which social media may be causing mental health issues. There have been a number of studies, but they're still looking for some more comprehensive studies. And so they've been calling on more federal funding to study the topic. They've also criticized, a number of government officials have, the tech giants for not making more internal data available to the public about what they know it's doing to the mental health, to the brain, and frankly, our brain chemistry. Lawmakers, we've talked about the hearings before, have criticized the social media like Meta, which owns Facebook and Instagram, TikTok, etc. There was that moment back in January where a senator made Mark Zuckerberg, the founder of Facebook, publicly apologize, stand up, turn around, and apologize to the families of children who had taken their own lives due to what they had experienced on social media. And yet, after that, we haven't seen much action from Congress. At the same time, as we wait for Congress to act, the Surgeon General laid out steps that communities, schools, parents can take to better protect the younger generation. That includes no phones in school, phone-free dinner time, bedtime, and social gatherings. They're talking about, demanding that your kids up until a certain age don't go to bed with their phones in their rooms, that there's a curfew for their phones, and that you wait until high school to allow social media apps. Right now, the law is 13 years old to get on social media. Jill, as I mentioned, we have a new premium podcast episode with Jonathan Haidt, the author of the New York Times bestseller, Anxious Generation, getting a lot of buzz right now. You may have seen him on all the major shows, podcasts. He's been with Oprah, Kim Kardashian, Tom Hanks. Remarkable. We spent a full hour with him, fascinating as he dove into effectively how we as a society, not just here in America, but around the world, have run a terrible experiment on kids for the last decade with some terrible consequences. I can't do justice to the entire conversation. You can join Mo News Premium with a 2-week free trial right now at mo.news/free trial. But I do want to play a clip from our conversation for all of you to get a sense of the case that he's been making in his book.
I can summarize the whole book by saying we have overprotected our children in the real world, and we have underprotected them online. And I usually get the question, wait, isn't that contradictory? Isn't that a paradox? How can you say we should be more protective in one place and less in another? And I'm like, wait a sec, why is this paradoxical? Imagine if if your house was at the edge of the forest, and if you go out the front door, you go into this beautiful meadow, and it goes on and on for a long time. And there are bunny rabbits and occasionally deer in the meadow. But if you go out the back door, you go into a big, thick woods where there are lions and tigers and bears and snakes. And what if in 2010 we said to our kids, don't go out the front door. It's too dangerous. You might get bitten by a bunny rabbit. But go out the back door. Go play in the woods. And, 10% of you will get addicted. A number of you will get sextorted. Some of you will commit suicide. But, it's the internet. It's what everyone's doing. I would venture to say that if that was your parenting philosophy, you should probably be less protective about the meadow and more protective about the woods. That's all I'm saying.
Moshe, it is so fascinating, and I've seen him everywhere, and I'm happy about it because it is such an important conversation. We both have young kids.
Right,
so
like too young where social media would not even be a question right now.
Yes, yeah. My daughter, I'm almost there, but I am hoping that within the next few years.
And we should note she's 5 years old. She's 5.
Yes, and I am hoping that within the next few years, parents really come together around this because Haidt points out the issue that the problem is that all the kids are on social media. So you really have to have
problem.
Exactly. So you have to have the parents on board. And it does feel like the tide is turning with schools. I'm starting to hear more and more schools saying, okay, enough with the phones already. And that does appear to be, I think, the low-hanging fruit, pardon that kind of overused expression.
Though, he notes, and you hear it a bit in that clip, that it's not just social media. It's not just the internet and smartphones. He takes this back to the 80s when parents stopped letting their kids outside. It was too scary outside. Like, you must be with them all the time. And he notes that the irony of ironies is that parents have never spent as much time with their kids as they do today.
Right.
And yet we have so many more mental health issues. And it's more than just people are comfortable talking about mental health issues. And so, what he's talking about there is that, we're so fearful of letting them outdoors. And so you talked about creating playborhoods with your, either a social group or your community, et cetera. We're so fearful of what happens in the real world when it's the digital world that is the much scarier place. I put out a clip on Instagram yesterday where he's like, where there's many more pedophiles, not the real playground, the digital playground. So, ultimately, there needs to be a recalibration going back to the move by parents to stop letting their kids outside alone, play, learn lessons with other kids unsupervised. And so more supervision online, less supervision in the real world is, in essence, what he's saying. And then, of course, it's left to parents out there to figure out how exactly to do that.
Okay, switching gears, President Biden is expected to announce a new immigration program today that would provide a path to citizenship for hundreds of thousands of immigrants in the country illegally who are married to U.S. citizens. The president plans to make the announcement at the White House alongside members of Congress, immigration advocates, and U.S. citizens who, because of old immigration rules, haven't been able to sponsor their longtime spouses for green cards. The program will likely benefit immigrants who have been living in the country for at least a decade, offering them work permits, deportation protections, and a route for them to apply for green cards, aka a pathway to citizenship. The program's size would make it one of the largest immigration initiatives started in recent decades, rivaled only by the DACA program that former President Obama created to benefit Dreamers in 2012. Dreamers, by the way, are young, undocumented immigrants who are brought in illegally by parents, but have grown up in the United States and identify as Americans. Back to the Biden announcement, though, the president's team honed in on the idea of providing immigration relief to spouses because a much smaller version of the program already had existed for a decade for military families. That is according to the Wall Street Journal. His advisors also pointed to polling that found that most Americans support granting legal status to spouses of U.S. citizens, even if they entered the country illegally.
Yeah, so the current law right now is that even if a migrant who entered the country via the southern border marries a U.S. citizen, the law says that he or she must first leave the country, leave the U.S. for 10 years before becoming eligible for a green card. So you came in illegally, you married an American. Law right now says you got to go leave the country for a decade before you can come back. So that's what they're trying to clarify here. The new program also has the benefit of targeting a population that immigration advocates say has felt neglected. You mentioned there was already a program here. If a member of the military had married someone who came across the country in an undocumented fashion. Still, Republicans are attacking this as a form of amnesty, mass amnesty, for several 100,000 people who didn't come here by the book. Biden here really trying to find the Goldilocks, the right temperature of the porridge, Jill, because 2 weeks ago he announced a bid to lower illegal crossings, one of his harshest immigration policies to date, an asylum ban on immigrants who cross the border illegally above a certain number, essentially a version of the plan that Trump had during his term in office, but with a huge number of migrants coming across the border. Biden has had to crack down here, in some cases unilaterally, but that has angered immigration advocates, Latino voters who he counts as part of his coalition. So at the same time, he's making this move to try to make them happy. Sort of what you find on a number of issues for Joe Biden is that he has his left flank yelling at him. He's got all the Republicans yelling at him. He's trying to find a middle road on this particular issue. I don't know how many people this will win over potentially. I mean, certainly there's a certain group in the middle that finds this logical, but for the left, it won't be enough given the other stuff. For the right, he's not cracking down hard enough. But it is notable, Jill, the shift. If you look at some recent polling that breaks down various populations of Americans and their views of undocumented immigrants, this number struck me. The number of Hispanic Americans who believe that people who come here illegally should be deported, for the first time recently, a majority of Hispanic Americans say yes, they should be deported. So they join a majority of white Americans who say that, a slight majority of Black Americans. It's unpopular with them, but among Hispanics, among whites, they support the program, and that's a program that Trump has talked about on the stump, that if he's elected, he has promised the largest deportation in American history.
Time for the speed read from CNN. A long-lasting and expansive heat wave fueled by an intense heat dome is underway for the Midwest and the Northeast. This will be extreme summer heat a bit earlier than we typically expect it. Record-breaking high temperatures will last until next week, ushering in the start of the summer with this year's most significant heat event yet. Hundreds of records could be tied or broken this week as that massive heat dome parks itself over part of the East. What is a heat dome, you might be wondering? Intense conditions that trap air in place and bake it with abundant sunshine for days on end that make each day hotter than the last. And it basically means that the overnight temperatures don't really cool down enough to offer relief.
It's essentially like literally living in a dome. If you put a large glass enclosure over the lower 48. Imagine that.
Help! No, but that is sort of the idea, though, that it doesn't cool down at night, which means that if you're overheated during the day, there's just a higher risk for heat-related illness. So that's the serious side of it. More than 260 million people will experience temps at or above 90 degrees this week, and temperatures will top out at about 15 to 20 degrees above normal over a sweeping area of the northeastern U.S. Monday afternoon. So you could expect temperatures to rise to about 25 degrees above normal for a big part of this week, for a big part of the United States.
Yeah, and then we can thank our Canadian friends. They're going to send down some cooler weather next week once we get through this week. At the same time, I hear from some of you who are like, oh, okay, it's summer, it's hot. We're used to it. Big whoop. But I will remind you of this, that there are more heat-related deaths every year in America and around the world than any other weather event. So that includes hurricanes and tornadoes and blizzards and cold. And so this is a serious matter. So government officials have been trying to do more to warn people about the heat, especially when it's at abnormal levels. NOAA, the federal agency, announced a new heat risk index. We'll include a link in the show notes. Essentially, if you're in the red or purple areas, that you will be experiencing very abnormal temperatures for your part of the country for that time of year. So that's just a heads up to people who are like, oh, it's hot. It's like, no, this is hotter than normal. So, take care of yourself. Make sure you're well hydrated, etc. Heat right now looks like it's going to be reaching dangerous levels in some major metropolitan areas like Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, New York City, Boston. And then you got the heat index, which takes you into the hundreds. So take care, stay hydrated, and stay indoors if you can.
And with the heat waves of fire in Los Angeles from KTLA, strong winds and hot temperatures are hindering efforts to contain a brush fire that's burned more than 15,000 acres in Los Angeles and Ventura counties. The wildfire is called the Post Fire. It erupted this weekend. It's about 8% contained. Fire officials say one commercial property was destroyed and about 10 other structures are threatened. About 50 homes also at risk, and some evacuation orders and warnings are in place.
Yeah, feel for those firefighters out there. The wind gusts reached 60, 65 miles per hour over the weekend. So very difficult to fight fires in those conditions.
From foreign affairs, alarmed by repeated warnings from top FBI and military officials, a former acting CIA director and a legendary foreign policy thinker are warning of the serious threat of a terrorist attack in the months ahead. In a piece titled "The Terrorism Warning Lights Are Blinking Red Again," former CIA chief Michael Morell and foreign policy expert Graham Allison write that there are striking echoes of the run-up to 9/11. That was when intel officials at the time were warning about Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. There are now similar warnings popping up from FBI Director Christopher Wray and Army General Eric Kurilla, the commander of CENTCOM, which includes the Middle East.
Yeah, we've had Morell on the podcast several times before. He's a former colleague. From CBS, and I actually reached out to him, Jill, to see if he could come on the podcast this week to talk further about his analysis here. He doesn't say this stuff lightly. He's not one of those that warns about this stuff every week. So this article certainly got our attention. They write that only with complete access to the intelligence information could one fully form an independent view of the threat. But given their experience, their vantage point, the fact that the FBI director and the CENTCOM commander are saying these things and using this language means there are serious concerns right now at the top levels of the government that their words should be taken seriously. And that while, we have heard warnings about terrorism over the course of the past 20 years since 9/11, a lot of them fortunately did not materialize, that in many cases, the public warnings did trigger government responses, did cause more people to kind of have their head on a swivel that thwarted terrorist plans. And so they argue that complacency is greater risk than alarmism right now. They're calling for a multi-step plan from President Biden and his team to thwart the attacks, noting there have been some near misses of late. We told you about the plots to assassinate former National Security Advisor John Bolton and the assassination plot recently to kill former President George W. Bush. That was thwarted. And they note that terrorists are pretty savvy. They watch what's happening in this country. And so each attack, not like the last, don't expect planes into buildings this time, that terrorists are likely looking at what goes on in this country and saying, what's really easy to do in America? Get a lot of guns and commit mass shootings. And so that's what they argue could be a potential strategy here. Again, from their analysis of statements, hoping, of course, that the White House and National Security team is on top of everything. And we should note, we did tell you last week about the arrest of those 8 individuals who came across the border with a connection to ISIS that they had been tracking for a while. So, the job of the FBI, DHS and company is they got to be right 100% of the time.
I was just thinking the exact same thing. It is such a thankless job because we don't really know about everything that they have prevented. Yeah. But if God forbid something were to happen, then it would be seen obviously as an epic failure.
They can't fail. Right? One thing slips through, and that's the issue. And that's, by the way, why we invest a lot of money and resources into the national security, especially post 9/11, created new departments, the Office of Director of National Intelligence, the DHS, et cetera, lessons from 9/11. And so I think they're just saying, hey, it's about time. We're seeing a lot of warning lights. We're seeing extremism at record levels abroad. We're seeing ISIS-K, do this attack in Moscow, connect with people coming across the border in the south. So let's be aware and let's make sure we're on top of everything.
From WGN TV in Chicago, the city on Monday issuing a formal apology to Black Chicagoans for the harm that slavery, Jim Crow laws, and present-day policies have had on them and their descendants. The mayor, Brandon Johnson, signed an executive order that also creates a, quote, reparations task force to develop a Black reparations agenda that will ultimately offer recommendations on remedies to the policies that have harmed African Americans in Chicago for generations. He has earmarked $500,000 in the city's budget to study the issues. Johnson announced that the executive order is not a public declaration. It's a pledge to shape the future of the city by confronting, he says, the legacy of inequity that has plagued Chicago for far too long. He added that the city looks to move forward in reconciliation through targeted investments aimed at rectifying decades of deliberate disinvestment in Black neighborhoods and communities.
So the order apologizes for history and then establishes a timetable and goals for the task force in looking at generational inequities in housing, health, education, policing policies, etc. We should note, Illinois ranked first among all states in the nation in the share of Black residents living in census tracts that are 90% Black. It is the most segregated state, most segregated city in the country. The separation between Black residents and non-Black residents and where they live, you can Google a whole bunch of maps, just get a sense of the segregation that continues to exist in Chicago. So it's an issue that he campaigned on, an issue that the mayor is pushing forth with here. And it comes after there have been a few cities across America that have launched similar efforts to study the legacy of slavery and systemic racism and have looked into reparations. That includes San Francisco, Detroit, and Asheville, North Carolina. And when it comes to reparations, nearby Evanston, Illinois, just right there on the Chicago border, just north there, in 2021 became the first city in America to make reparations available to Black residents for past discrimination, though they are facing legal challenges to the program. Recently, a conservative activist group filed a legal challenge there.
From the Washington Post, Maryland's Democratic Governor Wes Moore issuing a mass pardon of more than 175,000 marijuana convictions Monday morning, one of the nation's most sweeping acts of clemency involving a drug now in widespread recreational use. The pardons forgive low-level marijuana possession charges for an estimated 100,000 people. The governor saying it is a step to heal decades of social and economic injustice that disproportionately harms Black and brown people. Moore noted criminal records have been used to deny housing, employment, and education, holding people and their families back long after their sentences have been served. He says, quote, "We are not nibbling around the edges. We are taking actions that are intentional, that are sweeping, and unapologetic."
Moore is describing the scope of his pardons as far-reaching and aggressive. Maryland now among nearly a dozen other states and multiple cities that have pardoned hundreds of thousands of old marijuana convictions. Back in 2022, President Biden issued a mass pardon of federal marijuana convictions that impacted about 6,500 people. At the time, Biden called on governors to follow suit, especially now that recreational marijuana is legal in at least half the union. So Maryland's action here, one of the biggest. It rivals what Massachusetts did recently in terms of how many people it impacts. Maryland, of course, one of the states that has fully legalized cannabis sales. And that's been a move that states have been making to reap billions in revenue in recent years. And so you have a lot of states looking back at the conviction saying, you know, it's weird that it's now legal in this state, but people are still dealing with the ramifications of their convictions when it was illegal. Moore, by the way, somebody that you will probably be hearing more from in the coming years. He's considered a rising star in the Democratic Party and the lone Black governor of a U.S. state. Jill, we should note Wes Moore right now, the only Black governor in the entirety of the U.S. And only 5 Black people have ever served as governor of any of the 50 states in American history.
Some space news from The Verge. Voyager 1, the farthest human-made craft from the Earth, is still ticking away, billions of miles away. It is sending back data from all 4 of its scientific instruments after NASA got it back up and running remotely. Voyager 1 stopped sending back good data in November, and fixing it was fraught as engineers had to wait 45 hours to hear anything back. In April, the agency got it to start sending back health and status information, and And then science data from 2 of its instruments in May. Now NASA says Voyager 1, which is over 15 billion miles from Earth, is, quote, conducting normal science operations, and the agency just needs to resync its timekeeping software and do some maintenance on sparingly used digital tape recorder. And Moshe, like, as I say this, I'm just thinking, and here I can barely get cell service on certain parts of Long Island.
Voyager 1, we should note, passed all the planets decades ago. It is so far out there, Jill, it has left what's called the heliosphere, which is effectively the protective bubble of particles and magnetic fields around the sun. It is way off there, and it has gone way beyond where we thought it could go. Jill, this is 1970s technology. It was launched in 1977 for a 5-year flyby through 82 to study Jupiter and Saturn. But then it kept going and going. And if you remember the old Energizer Bunny commercials, Voyager 1 now has been going for 47 years. Way past what anyone thought it could go. And NASA's trying to just jam as long as it can jam on this thing. It is powered by a nuclear power supply that is running very low at this point. Again, given that they launched it for 5 years and it's running 47 years later, they've had to turn off the cameras. They turned off half the instruments a while ago. Voyager 2 was launched thereafter. Voyager 2 is out there as well, billions of miles away. And so it's teaching us stuff about a part of space that we don't know that much about. And as you mentioned, given how far away it is, 15 billion miles, 45 hours to hear anything back. So that means you send a signal, you wait 22 and a half hours for Voyager to receive it, and then another 22 and a half hours for Voyager for the signal it sends back to Earth. So effectively, you send something on Monday morning, you get it back on Wednesday morning, and so on and so forth. So rooting on Voyager 1. Keep going, buddy. See how far you can go.
And finally, our favorite story from the New York Post. U.S. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer was ready to man the grill on Father's Day, but couldn't handle the heat when a slew of food critics on social media questioned his skills with a spatula and a patty. All right, so you've got to see the picture to really understand what this is about. The senator posted a photo to Twitter or X of himself in front of a grill with burger patties and hot dogs and an ear-to-ear smile.
Yeah, like a very boyish smile. Like Chuck Schumer was like so pleased with himself in front of the barbecue. You almost feel bad as to what happened.
It was like first time manning the grill.
You're in your 70s and you're manning a grill for the first time. This is the photo you take.
So he tweeted... our family has lived in an apartment building for all of our years, but my daughter and her wife just bought a house with a backyard. And for the first time, we are having a barbecue with hot dogs and hamburgers on the grill. Father's Day heaven. But
there's always a but.
There's always a but. But commenters were quick to grill the New York legislator and wondered if a piece of cheese on a patty was placed there prematurely. So yes, this is about a piece of cheese on a raw burger.
Yeah, so people question Chuck Schumer's barbecuing. Why? Well, those of you who barbecue know, and if you've made a cheeseburger, you grill one side of the patty, you flip it, that's when you put the cheese on the burger. And in the photo, Chuck Schumer grinning ear to ear, it is clear that he's placed all the raw patties there, and you see a piece of what appears to be cheese on the raw side of the burger. Premature, Chuck. You don't place the cheese on the raw side of the burger. You wait for the cooked side. And so clearly acknowledging a failure here, someone in his office, I can't imagine Chuck doing this, but maybe he did, deleted the tweet and the photo because it was just getting pummeled on social media, being like, what the hell are you thinking? So effectively, Schumer deletes the photo. His office clearly then reposts just his Father's Day message without the photo as like a happy Father's Day, everyone. Like his acknowledgement. They didn't acknowledge the burger gate. But anyway, if you're going to post a photo as a very public person, make sure you have the tactic right. because the last thing you should be doing is showing people a strategy to get E. coli poisoning or some sort of foodborne illness, Jill.
But I think this is a missed opportunity for Chuck Schumer because he should really have had fun with this. Just be a little self-deprecating. It's not that big of a deal.
Why delete the tweet? Just like engage.
Delete it?
Engage.
Just
like, and by the way, some people thought it was like vegan burger, so like it's actually okay. I don't know. I was watching the whole debate here, but I agree with you, Jill. Just be like, oh, thanks for the tip. I'm 73 and barbecuing for the first time.
But he admitted, he's like, I grew up in an apartment. My daughter just got married and got a house that has a backyard. So he's admitting that this is his first time really grilling.
I guess,
He should have just owned it, laughed it off, and had a good time instead of deleting it.
I know.
Oh, it's like the picture still exists. We all have it.
Oh,
you know?
Oh, in fact, that made us more interested in it. All right, now time for On This Day in History. On this day this year, Chuck Schumer, no. On this day in 1873, suffragist Susan B. Anthony was fined after trying to vote in the 1872 election. She refused to pay it, and it would take 50 years or so before women would actually have a legal right to vote in elections. We should note in 2020, President Trump finally pardoned Susan Anthony for that conviction for voting illegally in the 1872 election. In another first for women, on this day in 1928, Amelia Earhart became the first woman to fly across the Atlantic. And on this day in 1983, the first American woman to fly into outer space, Sally Ride, was launched with 4 other astronauts aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger. Jill, one of my favorite stories about Sally Ride and the female astronauts, we talked about this in a podcast we did last year on the Mo.news interview podcast. Actually, it's episode 56, The Untold Story of America's First Women Astronauts, over on the Mo.news interview podcast, where we dive into all of this. But Sally Ride in particular had a lot of challenges dealing with all the male scientists at NASA as a first female astronaut. And so they're preparing all of the equipment that she needs for outer space, including, having the proper toilets, because they'd only had to develop stuff for men. And so they needed to develop all this technology. And then she finds in her package for space 100 tampons with the strings connecting them to each other like a strip of sausages so they wouldn't float away. And so the scientists at NASA said, hey, listen, astronaut Sally Ride, is 100 okay? And she goes, I'm going to be in space for a few days. What do you think this is? And so she finds a string of 100 tampons. Anyway, among the challenges women had being the first astronauts for NASA, it's among the stories we dive into again. Episode 56 over in the Mo.news interview pod.
Men.
Can you imagine? There wasn't the internet back then, so I guess they just didn't bother going to the library, or maybe clearly the scientists here did not have a woman in their life.
They were probably just trying to air
wives.
They were probably just trying to err on the side of caution and just think, you know what, we'll give her 100. That's got to cover it.
But what's crazy is, there's such little space when you go into space, in compartments in the space shuttle. So you have to be very strategic about what you do. So it just gave you a sense of they had no idea what they're talking about. So one of Sally Ride's favorite stories. All right, we end here with a bit of music history. Paul McCartney turning 82 years old today, everybody. Born on this date in 1942. So we figured no better way to commemorate his birthday with the Beatles' birthday song. And turning 47 years old today, Dreams by Fleetwood Mac reaching #1 on the Billboard charts on this day in 1977.
Hence your clue at the top of the podcast.
You knew it, Jill. You knew it. It's a good song. Fleetwood, at their peak before they all broke up with each other, because there was a bunch of relationships within Fleetwood Mac, had a really great string of hits.
Landslide, still one of my favorites.
Jill, one of the first dates I went on with Alex, she was working at Madison Square Garden, and Fleetwood was doing their tour, and got to see them perform, albeit just a few years ago, but still jamming out. It was great to see them do their thing.
Till the landslide brought us down. All right. Thank you for listening to the Mo.news podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. and review us in the App Store.
Those reviews make a difference, so we appreciate all of you who have reviewed us, especially over on the Apple podcast platform. And so everyone, have a great holiday, and we will see you back here on Thursday.